Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in this series of essays, discussions of Ayn Rand. This time, we will be discussing again sense of life, but now applied from another perspective. The essay is Art and Sense of Life. It was published in 1966 and it appeared in The Objectivist and was later anthologized in the Romantic Manifesto. And while preparing for this essay, I saw that one of the masters of Ayn Rand in writing is in the sense that she can be extremely abstract in one sense, in one paragraph, and fully concretize what she's saying in the next one without any problems. What we're discussing today is, as always, with Don Watkins and James Valliant. You've been with us a couple of times, and to introduce them, Don has co-authored books like Equalism Unfair or The Moral Case for Finance, and he's running the website donswriting.com, where you can find his courses. And James is the author of Creating Christ and The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, and both know the drill in objectivism and will help us to tackle this essay. And for the people who are listening live on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions on Super Chat. We're tracking it live. And so, okay, let's go through the discussion. And I think one of the crucial things that we should recap to understand this essay are probably three, but maybe two essays of Ayn Rand, which appeared previously both in The Objectives and the Romantic Manifesto, which are Philosophy of Sense of Life, which we talked about last week, but also the Psychoepistemology of Art. So what do, in essence, say that those essays and what in those essays is relevant for the discussion today?
Well, I'll just summarize them very briefly, and then Jim, if you want to elaborate anything. So in the Psychoepistemology of Art, Ayn Rand argues that art fulfills a vital need of the mind, which is to take our broadest views of the nature of man and nature of reality and turn them into a concrete that allows us to hold in mind our widest abstractions in perceptual form. And so that's the basic survival value of art. And then what we talked about with sense of life was the way in which we all have an implicit view of life. We all have these wide metaphysical abstractions, these wide views of what man is and where man is, but we hold them in emotional form. And the task of philosophy is to make them explicit so we can think, is our sense of life, is our basic emotionally held view of reality right or wrong? And if it's wrong, to correct it. And now we're going to get the kind of uniting of those two issues, the need for art and sense of life.
Right. Remember to understand the role of art in human life, according to Ayn Rand, is to understand the role of concepts in our cognition. Unlike animals, we can rise above the level of mere sense perception. We can abstract, we can integrate our perceptions and in the process, discover invisible relationships and causes, even invisible stuff like atoms and molecules. But to get at that, we've got to achieve a certain kind of unit economy, a kind of efficiency to integrate our sense perception that way. And that, Ayn Rand says, is the basic function of concepts, unit economy. To, in effect, by giving a word to a vast abstraction, say liberty, rights, freedom, something like that, that's a vast abstraction. That's kind of an invisible idea that is otherwise only accessible through concepts. What art can do is actually render, just as there's a sort of a parallel here, just as a word can allow us to efficiently deal cognitively with an abstraction by rendering it into a single concrete, a word. So a work of art can allow us to process it emotionally, to experience it emotionally by rendering an abstraction into a stylized concrete. This time, not an arbitrary symbol like a word, but the actual concrete itself, stylized in such a way as to evoke our abstract values. And it's not just cognitive things like molecules and freedom, but values. that we hold on an abstract level. So the only way we can really experience our values in a perceptual way is by having art render them perceptual for us.
Sure. So, with what you have just said, James, I think it's a great way to introduce the first part of the essay, which is the relationship between art and sense of life as such. And you basically touched both a bit of what people are seeing in art and the way that and a bit of the relationship between art and sense of life. But could you talk a little bit more on what is the relationship between these two concepts from an artist's perspective in the way that Rand's taking this into account?
We have no choice but to think abstractly in concepts. That's how human beings come to know things. And either they know them conceptually or they don't. They're just limited to the perceptual level. Therefore, for the artist's perspective, it's a question of rendering those emotional abstractions that we necessarily reach, even outside of the context of art, on a philosophical level, on a metaphysical level. Is reality knowable? Is life worth living? Am I worthy of living? Am I capable of living? Is the world so inimical to me that my values cannot be achieved? Or the opposite, is the world a benevolent place? Is reason efficacious? Things like that. Abstractions at that level are just that, abstractions. Values at that level are just that, values. In order to experience those emotions in a concrete way, we need art. We're going to have abstract sense of life emotions, whether we do art or not. That's just the way humans are. They're conceptual. However, to experience, in effect, our metaphysics perceptually, we need art.
So, for instance, when Michelangelo tried to portray or to make the David, for instance, he was having an idea in mind and then he put into a concrete form, or what was the exact process that Michelangelo would have had to go through to make such a sculpture such as the David? Is it more, is it that conscious, or is it more a feeling, concrete, some sort of resemblance, and then he tries to portray that feeling into a concretized way? Could you explain a bit more of that? Maybe I don't want to contribute with my confusion, but
Well, you have to distinguish two things. One is, what is the essential process involved in the creation of art? And Rand likens it. It's not exactly what's going on, but she likens it to deduction, which is that you're going from the abstract to the more concrete. And so the essence of art is that you have a view of life, and then you're turning that into a specific concrete that embodies that view of life. But it's not that an artist necessarily sits down and goes, what's my view of life? All right, how am I going to illustrate that? It can be much more emotional, but even if the person's very rational, it doesn't have to be articulated in that way. It can be, I find this really interesting, or like, I want something that just conveys the sense of awe I felt. It can be in those kinds of emotional terms, but you're thinking of something you want to capture about what's important to you, what the way that you look at life. And, you have to talk to the individual artist to get a sense of exactly how they're doing it. And part of what makes that difficult is that not every artist is fully self-conscious of what they're doing. They are more or less rational in the way that they operate. So when she's saying that in essence, that's what's going on, it doesn't mean that every artist is consciously sitting down and like they read the Romantic Manifesto and now they're trying to implement. Not even a great artist, but they definitely have a sense of, there's something important I want to capture about life as I see it. And that's what I'm going to put on the page. And that, I think, is inescapable. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody who does anything artistic is even doing that much. So I think there's people, particularly today, when there's this vast gulf that's made between art and entertainment. I think there are people just sit down and go, hey, I got to get the audience's juices flowing. That's going to be really fun. You know, what would be cool? And there's still a sense in which they're bringing to the table part of their view of life, but it's not an artistic process. It's I think more like a product design sort of process. And then there's pure hacks who are just, hey, how am I going to get people to like pay me money for stuff? And there Ayn Rand refers to as imitation, where there's no sense of life issue because they're not even trying to give what they think is important. They're trying to just copy other people who are conveying what's important so that they can make a few bucks. So she's a very kind of deep perspective, and to see how it applies or doesn't apply to any given individual artist, there's more fine-grained distinctions one has to make.
Yeah, I think a good artist, is going to have to be self-aware in one sense, the skill of what he or she is doing. That is to say, Michelangelo, as he's practicing sculpture, let's say, is getting better at expressing himself, what he wants to express in the marble. And on the other hand, when it comes to getting at his sense of life, that may be a purely emotional thing for him. He may not have any self-conscious philosophical awareness that he's expressing a sense of life, a philosophical view of reality. He may not know it at that level, and the sense of life may be a purely emotional matter for him. However, a skilled artist will have, insofar as they are a skilled artist, will be self-conscious of, say, if they're a writer, plotting and character development, or if they're a painter, composition and color, things like that. That's where in terms of technique, you see a great artist. In terms of their sense of life, it may all be operating at an emotional subconscious level for the artist, just as it is for the viewer. And neither may properly, explicitly identify what's going on. They may both just be having an emotional reaction. The artist puts it in there because it happens to express his sense of life, and the viewer likes it because it confirms their sense of life. Yes, that is life to me. That is important to contemplate. And that part of it can be done on a purely emotional level.
And on the side of the perceiver of the art, maybe one of the questions that I have is, to what degree does the process have to be, I don't know how to, rationally driven, in the sense of what degree of interpretation one has to go through to experience the emotion? For instance, can there be mistakes in the interpretation of what an artwork is? So, for instance, see the David as someone that just wants to kill a guy and then feels an awful emotion about that.
Yes. there are wrong ways of looking at art, and the artist himself may not even understand what his plot is saying, what the theme of his plot is. He may not. The artist may not really even understand the sense of life that he's going for, but the skill in terms of getting to it is something that we can assess independently from whether or not we emotionally agree or philosophically ultimately agree with what his sense of life statement is. That's the distinction I think I'd draw.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't unique to art, right? Like any emotional experience, you can get wrong objectively in the sense that you might misinterpret the phenomenon, right? Like, you've ever had that person who you think, oh man, like he or she is really flirting with me. This is really going great. And you realize that like they're trying to rob your wallet, or they're interested in your friend or something. And so you've had this reaction that's inappropriate to the concrete in front of you. And that can certainly happen in art. I think often, and maybe even more often, what happens rather than misinterpretation is a lot of people will get left cold by more sophisticated, great art because they're not used to the effort that one has to go in order to have an emotional reaction to it. So like Ayn Rand's works are really interesting in that they're so accessible and so deep at the same time. I think romantics in particular are great at that. Like you can read Hugo, you can read even Dostoevsky and have a heavy emotional influence. But if you've ever tried to read like Gogol or like any of the Russian authors or something, you often have to put a lot of work into it. Or I would say the visual arts, paintings, very much like it can be. I'll just speak for myself, which is I would look at them and think, oh, that's kind of nice, but I wouldn't really have any sort of emotional reaction to paintings. And then I had a friend who actually said, all right, no, this is the system of the process you have to go through to see what the artist is trying to do. To like, it's not just going to jump out at you passively. You have to be mentally active. And then he walked me through these steps. And by the end of it, I was, like awestruck by the particular painting we were looking at, which is The Painter's Honeymoon, if anybody's ever seen it. And so but what that should point to is that there's a cognitive element, and sometimes the cognitive elements you're responding to are just going to jump in front of your face. Like, if you watch most movies, you're going to have some kind of emotional reaction if it's at all a decent movie, even if it's like a movie that you are horrified by, but if it tells a story that has some kind of a meaning to it. But oftentimes you have to put in work. But the point is that you have to understand, what is this saying? And it's to the extent that you have a view of what this is saying that you're going to have some kind of emotional reaction to it. And the more that you're right about what it's saying, the more that your emotional reaction will be appropriate to the actual concrete. There's a really funny story Leonard Peikoff tells that I think kind of highlights this, which is he went to see some movie and he came back and told Ayn Rand, oh, you have to see this. This was such a great movie and everything. She goes to see it and it was god awful. And she was horrified and like, what were you thinking? And what he realized was he was just in love with the actress and didn't pay attention to the weird, story that was on the screen. So that's an emotional reaction that if you're self-conscious about that, like this is a bad movie, but she's amazing, then it's fine. But if you're seeing that as the essence of the film, and objectivists, particularly people like Ayn Rand, will often do this for better and for worse, right? Like how many times have we heard, oh, here's a quote that's kind of like heroic or pro reason or pro freedom, like therefore, like this is a great movie, and it's, well, that's a great quote, but you're not being objective about the actual meaning of the movie.
Absolutely. And I have a very similar experience set with visual art and even poetry that Don did. I'll tell you, my primary education in, say, poetry completely killed the art for me. I thought it was boring, stupid, silly. I did not get what poetry was all about until someone who knew the subject sat me down, explained the different forms of poetic techniques, how they are used to achieve the emotional impact that they achieve. And suddenly I had, the light bulb went on, and he read to me a couple of poems to express what he meant here, and boom, I suddenly was laughing and crying and moved, and suddenly all these emotions were alive and colorful to me because someone skilled had pointed out to me how that art works and what makes it, how the artist achieves the emotional effect. Very much so. We can learn. I think music is something that, as Ayn Rand points out, seems to bypass our cognition and go straight to our emotions. But even in that area, I find my musical taste is sophisticated. Let me put it this way: over the years, as my understanding of music and how composers and musicians achieve the effect has increased.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a big difference what you're raised on. Like, I think if you like, because usually like pop music is very accessible because it's very simplified, right? It's
Yeah.
basically like the orgasm with no foreplay, and so with classical music, it's the kind of like taking a basic idea and doing these increasingly complex things and taking you in whole emotional journeys. But that's very hard to take in for somebody who's completely unfamiliar with it, which I certainly was. And it was only by repeated listening and even starting to study music and getting some basic music theory, and then having people point out to me what's going on, even something as kind of perceptually self-evident as music. Yeah, that it rose to the level of actual an aesthetic experience.
Right.
So there's definitely learning how to enjoy art. And I mean, there's been people, so let me give some explicit recommendations on these fronts, because if it's such a valuable thing, and some objectivists have done really good work. So the person who taught me how to enjoy the visual arts is a person named Luke Travers, who, if you look him up, LUC Travers, teaches people how to do this with the visual arts. Lisa Van Dam has given courses that I benefited from on poetry. And Leonard Peikoff's 8 Great Plays is I think the ultimate foundation for understanding literature and plays. Like, what goes into taking something that you might go, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting, and having it change your life. And then Lisa also has her Read With Me app, where she goes through these great works of literature and teaches you how to, enjoy them and get more out of them. And I'm sure there's other people I'm missing, but those are the ones that I'm most acquainted with.
I have had the pleasure and privilege of having gone through a museum tour of William Bouguereau's work with Luke, and it is mind-blowing.
Wow.
An emotional experience, very much so. And Lisa Van Dam, her lectures on literature have rendered me in tears, left me in tears, literally. So yeah, I gotta second those recommendations.
Well, I'm envious. I basically have nothing like that. I tried to prepare for this by reading my 2 favorite poems and just tried to see how it went through, and I love them. And I said, well, anyways, I think actually we will talk a bit more about this idea of this is what life means to me, this quote feeling, later. But I think it would be interesting to talk a bit about the differentiation between perceiving art against teaching. What would Rand say? Is art does art has any purpose in teaching? Does one go and see art because one wants to learn something?
Art can teach, but its fundamental function is not didactic, is not educational at all. It's the emotional experience. Art is for contemplation. Art is for the simple emotional edification of seeing our highest values, our most abstract evaluations rendered concretely so that we can experience them emotionally. And it's that emotional experience that art is all about. If some work of art happens to have some educational impact, that is very, very secondary or tertiary. It is true that I learned a great deal, especially, say, from Ayn Rand's novels. They were tremendously educational for me. But the primary value of the Fountainhead for me was emotional, was psychological.
Thank you. And another, connecting to that, right after talking about the relationship between learning and this relationship between learning and art, Rand talks about the need of a comprehensive view of existence. So, what is the relationship between that and a sense of life? Basically, I think we touched that previously on the previous essay discussion, but maybe it would be interesting to jump from that to the relationship between art and reality.
So if you think about what we've talked about in terms of these concepts, so it's that we build up over the course of our early lives a basic, implicit, emotionally held view of the world. And then what is the purpose of philosophy? The purpose of philosophy is to put that into conceptualize all that explicitly, and then think about it, validate it, make sure, all right, is this true? Well, then you need philosophy as a guide. And part of Ayn Rand's view of what do you need in order to be able to hold this extremely abstract and general set of abstractions in mind as you're thinking about different issues, as you're forming your goals, as you're trying to formulate a whole code of values to live your life by, as you're having to like make particular choices in very complex situations. How do you hold a whole philosophy in mind? So remember, I don't have it near me. Leonard Peikoff has an extremely essentialized presentation of all of objectivism. And I don't remember, is it like 650 pages, give or take, Jim?
Yeah.
You can't hold all of that in mind just on its own. Even if you did, like, Muslims who are seriously like memorize the Quran, you still if you had it memorized, couldn't hold it all in mind at once. And so in order to be able to live by a philosophy, even once you've thought it through and worked it out and adopted it, in order to actually make use of it, you need to be able to hold it in mind all at once. And that is the function of art. It's that we are able to hold a whole world view in a single concrete. And it's like Jim said, that all of our knowledge is really about condensing things into a dealable with number of units so that we can actually use them and aren't just overwhelmed by them. Okay, so now we have art as a way to hold a whole world view. But that's not the only thing that we need. We also need, and this is something Ayn Rand spends a lot of time in this essay discussing incredibly eloquently. Why are we trying to hold this philosophy in mind to make our decisions? Because we're living life long range. We're trying to achieve long range, ambitious goals. We're here and we want to get there. And the more ambitious we are, the further there is away, and the more different it is from where we are. And so, how do you maintain the motivation to go on that quest? Like, all the hardships you're going to face, all of the things that are kind of pulling you in different directions. Take a very delimited goal. You want to write a novel. So I just did this. I'm very self-aware of what that felt like and how hard it was. That's a goal that's going to take a year to maybe 3 years, depending on, some novels, maybe 10, but in general, it's a couple years. Imagine trying to live your life and hold on to that motivation in the face of all of the things that are pulling you away from it. And Ayn Rand's view is, you need the emotional experience of having achieved your ideal world, your ideal life now, like not every moment of your life, but you need it regularly. You need that feeling of that this is what it feels like to achieve my goals. This is why I'm struggling so hard. So for example, like if you're trying to achieve a certain kind of moral character, like I want to achieve full self-esteem, I want to be honest, have integrity, I want to be a man of justice. How do you hold that in mind when, for example, it's easier not to pick a fight right now? Like that's just going to piss people off. Maybe I'm going to lose some friends over this decision. What if I have to change jobs? How do you hold on to the abstraction of, no, I want to be a person of honesty and integrity and justice in the face of these very real situations that are uncomfortable, time consuming, even painful and costly? I need to experience now that no, there's a value that's way more important than any of my immediate struggles. And that is what art is going to give you. It gives you the ability to hold your philosophy in mind and experience your long range values today so that you have the motivation to continue on that quest to achieve them.
Absolutely. That said it so very well. It took me, to write Creating Christ, it took me 30 years. I'm still in the process of writing another book that I took on at that same time to hold in mind the values that you need to achieve a multi-decade long goal. You absolutely need the emotional fuel that art is. No question about it. Even in
And
our romantic lives, another place where we see sense of life expressed so eloquently, but all of our long-term goals. We live a lifetime. And it's hard to, as Don so brilliantly put it, it's hard really to emotionally experience that 30 years out. I need to experience it now. Leonard Peikoff once asked me, he said, Jim, why aren't you going into philosophy? Why are you a trial lawyer? And I said to him, I just don't have the emotional patience you do. You admit you're not going to see the impact of your work in your lifetime. You admit it. Well, I don't have that kind of moral character. I need to see the impact in my lifetime. I need to see that guilty verdict and see the justice done right here and now. And art gives us that with values that we cannot experience right here and now or in the next couple of weeks. That could take years or decades to achieve.
I'm sorry to hear but that hasty. But one of the things that you've just said, Don, made me question a bit on. You mentioned the idea of of a person experiencing a full philosophy through concretes, but from the artist side, in the sense of retaining all this view of life, how does it feel? And I'm telling you as as a novelist, and probably, I mean, many people have this experience of when reading Ayn Rand. When they reread her, they always find something new because she was so aware of what she was trying to convey, and also very aware of the world that her characters were living in. So, what is how does an artist see this um, their personal world and retain it, and put it into a work of art, maybe.
Well, it's precisely, I think, part of the drive to become an artist is that they have a sense of there's something I want to get out. And you'll often hear that kind of language. There's something inside me I've got to get out there. And so I think for artists, part of it is it's a process of discovery. Part of how what they're trying to get at is they have a sense that they see the world differently than other people. And it's that, and their need is I've got to get it out there. I've got to crystallize it. I've got to make it into something so that it's no longer this incoherent voice in my mind or in my soul, right? I'm trying to use very common sense language so that it actually connects to how I think artists actually experience it. But it's something like that. It's that they have a sense that they're seeing the world differently from other people, and they're often very critical of the art they see in the world because it's no, this isn't getting at my way of looking at things. I'm not satisfied with it, and there's something I really want to say. And so it's through the creation process that they fully articulate that. So I don't think, even for Ayn Rand, I don't think that it's like she worked out all of objectivism. I mean, it's a factual matter. She didn't do this. Worked out all of objectivism and then wrote her novels. It's that the two kind of grew together. Now, it doesn't mean that she just plowed in and started writing and said, "Oh, I like hope this all turns out." She planned her novels meticulously. But the point is, if you look at her journals, which have been published and are, I mean, really incredible, part of what you see is that she's working out her philosophy in order to write her novels. Part of her motivation for working out and a lot of the philosophic ideas are in part like she's trying to live her life, but a lot of it is I need to understand this in order to portray my ideal man, in order to understand why people aren't don't live up to moral ideals. And so it's that quest to kind of work out your view and get it down because you have a sense that you have something to say, that I think is a lot of what's going on now. I think it's the issue of revisiting her is a little bit more than that. I think that has to do with genius primarily. I'm in that the you can do worthy art and it not be exactly something worth revisiting if it's just not profoundly deep and new and challenging. And that's fine. We need that too, right? Like we need Agatha Christie novels, we need Tom Watkins novels. Hell. But it's a genius, whether it's Ayn Rand or Dostoevsky or even Tolstoy in his own way, that I think like that's what makes them not just people who are worthy of like reading for the sake of like transporting you to their world, but revisiting because of the profundity with which they really understood, even if sometimes misunderstood, things that are important about human beings, things are important about life. And so I think that's kind of a separate category, though a really important one.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why Rand is so easy to revisit is because she is so philosophically profound and comprehensive. She has a metaphysics, epistemology. She has the foundations of ethics all worked out, and practically no other novelists have that kind of a self-aware philosophy. But as Don points out, most of her philosophy was really the product of her working out her novels. So much of her philosophy was the product of her writing and the process of character development. I mean, if you think about it, take, for example, what we're discussing here, the role and function of art. In order to understand that, Ayn Rand had to understand where emotions come from, that there is a cognitive basis for emotions. Now, the world of psychology had not yet caught up to her. The cognitive behavioral psychology in the second third, say, or the last third of the 20th century started picking up steam and becoming a big psychotherapeutic idea. But Ayn Rand had that idea, understood that, it was sort of a discovery process of her own, but it was built into her characters. She understood that that's where emotions came from. That's where the emotions of her characters come from. And that's how she's going to evoke emotions in you, the reader. And that's how she's going to come to understand the role of art and what her novels actually achieve. But the discovery, say, of the cognitive basis of emotions is a revolutionary idea, and one she herself discovered in the process of being a novelist.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing about this, and it's sort of a diversion, but I figured it out this morning, so that I'm excited to mention it. Which is that because it's related to this point, not necessarily the art, but just Ayn Rand in general, revisiting her and what is it that she's doing that's makes her on the one level so easy to read, like she's so clear, and yet you find like I need to keep coming back to it. And I think there's this phenomenon of that the most profound thinkers are the people who can make ideas that are complex very simple without being simplistic. So if you've ever seen Richard Feynman, the physicist, he can explain these concepts in physics with enormous clarity. And you can feel after you've heard it, oh, now I understand this. And you do. But you don't understand it the way a physicist does it, because that simplicity is disguising an enormous amount of complexity he had to go through to get to that simplification. And if you haven't gone through that, then that knowledge doesn't stand in your mind the way that it does for Feynman, which means you can't use it to figure out other things in the world. So if he explains to you why plates spin, right? You can go, oh, cool, now I get it. But now if somebody asks you, like, why do balls roll or something, you can't perform that kind of integration because you don't have the context. So you need that Feynman to continually give you these simplified pieces that make sense to you. And I think it's the same thing that Ayn Rand is doing, which is that she has gone through and conceptualized the world and made it really simple. And what a professional intellectual, in effect, has to do is delve underneath it and get, oh, what was the kind of like that confusing, complicated world that went into this simplicity? And all learning is a process of, I think, starting with the simple that you often inherit from a genius and going back through that confusion. And then you've come out the other end when you can make it simple again. And just to give one illustration of how I think this works. So there's a principle in objectivism that I don't believe we've talked about, but I'm sure it'll come up at some point, which is that there's these, in order to figure out complicated cases. So if you've ever heard people like, all right, let's figure out what's true in ethics. Let's start out with this ethical quandary, like, two men in a lifeboat that can only hold one, like, what should they do? And objectivism's view, there's a lot to say about that, but one point is that you don't think about principles with these tough borderline cases. You figure out your principles by looking at clear-cut center of the page cases, and then you use the principles that you've already held and validated to solve something that's complicated. Well, there's a similar principle in writing, which is that a mistake that people trying to communicate who's still learning to communicate make is they try to like make every sentence precise and fully explanatory on its own terms. Whereas the objectivist point is you state the basic idea and then you can elaborate it. You can say these are the exceptions to it, but you don't try to build it in. So this will amuse you guys. This is how I went and tried to define free will in a op-ed I wrote in my early 20s. All right, where is it? This is great. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm defining free will, or free speech rather, for people. I say free speech means the right to express the products of the mind, scientific conclusions, artistic creations, political views, etc., using whatever words or images one chooses over a medium one can rightfully access without interference by the government. So you see, I tried to put in everything one would, need to clarify about free will into a definition to the point where you can understand it. This is Ayn Rand's definition. Let's see if you think this is better. The right of free speech means that a man has the right to express his ideas without danger of suppression, interference, or punitive action by the government. Now, notice, in order to really make use of that idea, like, it's totally clear, but if you want to make use of it, if you want to be able to apply it, you need to know other things. And she goes on to explain, for example, this means the right to property. Like it only applies to government. It implies to government promoting ideas as well as suppressing the thing. So she gives all kinds of context, but for many of her ideas, she doesn't. She just gives you that simple, the equivalent of free speech means, no suppression of ideas by the government, and then moves on to something else. And so that's why we can have the experience of Ayn Rand is so clear, but there's so much underneath it because she doesn't always give us all of those presuppositions that one needs to get what free speech really is and how it applies. So that's what a genius is doing, is that there's a whole bunch of work underneath what they give you. And what they give you is kind of the final clarifying surface level. And that's not exactly the right way to put it. That they make getting to what seems like a simple surface level look easy, where that's very, very hard. So that's my digression for the day.
Well, one that really not a bad digression. One final thought on that. Even a brilliant guy like Leonard Peikoff, years after reading Atlas Shrugged and rereading Atlas Shrugged and rereading Atlas Shrugged and still talking to Ayn Rand for years, he would come up with a question 10, 15 years later and say, what about this point? And Ayn Rand would say, well, it was in Atlas Shrugged. Didn't you see it there, Leonard? And Leonard, whoa, you mean it was in Atlas Shrugged? Where? And Ayn Rand would still have to point. Ayn Rand would point out where it was and go, oh yeah, black and white right there in Atlas Shrugged. I just didn't see it at that level. I was reading it at this other level. So never beat yourself up. When you're reading a genius, it's going to take many, many passes and you still may not get it all.
Okay, thank you. What about those sculptors that they have to study the whole human body and then you just see a person, but the artist had to go through skeletons and study muscles and skin?
Oh,
And everything.
yeah. So for me, the most striking example I ever had of that kind of experience was I went to I might botch the pronunciation, but Taliesin West, which is in Arizona. It was Frank Lloyd Wright's school. He had two of them, East and West. And my tour guide was one of the students at this school. And we're looking at one of these buildings, and he was explaining to me the way in which every one of, like, I forget exactly what it was, but like the shingles stood into a particular relationship with the tiles for the stairs, and that they were all lined up in a certain way. And you realize that your experience is just going, this is a beautiful building. I feel so at ease. Like you're having these kind of just very like, common sense kind of reactions to it. And then what you see is, in order to get that reaction, they had to be masters of every detail that went into it. And that's what real artists and thinkers are doing, is that they, in order to give you a reaction to something as a whole, they have to understand how every little part of it works. You don't, as the viewer, you just experience the whole.
Right.
But they are or as Leonard would say, WHOLE. But they need to understand every little part. And I mean, that's why, like, I marvel at novelists, right? Because I think I gave the example on one of my OPAR podcasts of Ayn Rand took one paragraph from her work and explained like every formulation and word choice that went into it. And I think, how do you even physically do that for a novel the size of Atlas Shrugged? And part of what's difficult about it is like the number of like writing principles and premises one would have to form in order to be able to have reasons for including every little piece of it. Because the point with architecture is not that like I wouldn't think, even if I sat down and said, I want to have a reason for everything. On what basis do I have a reason for what size the damn shingles are? And notice in the Fountainhead, Rourke has the same issue. That's what Cameron says. He comes to Henry Cameron as a kid who has some basic premises of architecture that are very innovative, but there's certain questions in design that he doesn't have reasons for choosing one thing rather than the other. And Cameron says, this is garbage. You get a cool idea and you don't know what to do with it. And so part of what Cameron does is says, this is the kind of way to think about the principles that should govern in these smaller choices that you don't yet know what you're doing. And that's what it means to learn how to be a creator, is to build up those premises so that everything is intentional and has the effect that you want it to have on a person who doesn't know all of the thinking behind each little bit of what you're doing.
And this idea is absolutely critical to Ayn Rand's understanding of art. Nothing should be accidental. Everything should be there for a reason, for the impact, for the delivery of whatever the emotional goal of the work of art is. That's what we can do with art, as opposed to, say, a simple journalistic description or just a flat photograph of something. That's reality. Reality so stylized as to evoke the highly abstract is what art is all about. And so every single element of it has to be chosen and selected on purpose. And so you have Da Vinci and Michelangelo actually doing anatomical dissection studies, knowing about the human body so that they know how to create the human body they want to express. And then you can, just to use one example, I'll just use one little teeny example to give you the idea. Well, I said earlier that poetry had been driven out of my head by my education. Well, one of the little things about, say, poetic technique that was taught to me by a real expert was what a good rhyme is. You know, you can hear a rhyme like in a jingle. There's a old TV commercial that goes, "Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us." It's for a fast food hamburger joint. Now, upset us and lettuce. Well, why shouldn't it be the pickles and upset us that rhyme? You think about a rhyme, upset us, lettuce, completely arbitrary, no particular reason for lettuce and upset us to rhyme, as opposed to, say, the pickles. Now take a good rhyme. And when I found your flesh did not resist, it was the living spirit that I kissed. Ooh, kissed resolves the tension created in resist. Now you can do that with any art. You can break down the techniques by which the artist is doing that. And an artist is someone who is at home and has automatized the skills within that art so that they know how to achieve, in effect, the emotional impact. To invoke, if you will, the philosophical through the concrete.
It's a really good example, Jim. What line is that from?
Oh, it's from one of my favorite poems called "The Marriage" by the 20th century American poet Ivor Winters.
All right.
I'm gonna go through it. So I want to talk a bit more about this relationship between art and reality. But first, we have a couple of super chat questions. The first one is from Marvin, and he says, "Is emotional focused advertisement, for instance, video, image, is it an attempt to convey a sense of life and to associate it with a product? Is it linked to art? For instance, adverts for luxury and lifestyle products?"
I would be wary of, I think that in advertisement, one can be artistic, but it is not in itself art. Right? That's a distinction I would draw. One can use artistic technique. I was just using poetry. One can use poetic technique without writing a poem. Now, advertisement has a specific utilitarian end to convey certain information. In fact, it has more than just conveying information. It conveys an evaluation about the product or the information that it's conveying. So it has a utilitarian end. But since it does convey an evaluation of the product as well, there can be aesthetic elements in the conveying of that. The fact that a utilitarian object, like an automobile, has aesthetic qualities to it, you can look at the car from one standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint, but it serves a utilitarian function. The car itself is not, say, a work of art qua car, although there are artistic elements that go into its design. I would say the same could be true, say, about an television ad. It could have artistic elements in it, but it has a specific utilitarian end to convey information.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Though one thing I'll add is, remember, Rand's view is that sense of life is involved in everything, right? It's part of every other emotion. So think about something that you might think is kind of somewhat related, like, your typical beer commercial, right? They don't just show you the beer, they show you a scene. And it's the scene of, maybe like women and men relaxing around the pool, everybody's splashing around, having fun. And part of it is the idea is, isn't this the world you want to live in? But it's not at a metaphysical level of this is life as I see it, but like, wouldn't this be a fun time? But how important you grant splashing around by the pool with a bunch of, scantily clad adolescents, that's going to be very different reaction depending on your sense of life. Like if you're somebody whose sense of life is more oriented towards kind of like achievement and what Ayn Rand calls a moral sense of life, then that's probably not going to have the same reaction to you, where like people are more, or their view is kind of more like fatalistic, and what they long for is an escape from the drudgery and dreariness of everyday life. Like your sense of life will cause you to have different reactions, or it will play a role in different reactions to that image, but it's not an aesthetic experience that one's having when one's watching, the TV commercial.
Exactly.
Thank you. And the other super chat is from Jeff, and he says, I know I will never be a John Galt, but taking steps towards it changes you. The journey is the living part. I'm not sure if that's a question.
I'm just going to say amen to that. I'm just going to say amen to that. When I read The Fountainhead, I was a teenager, and I knew immediately that I was not Howard Rourke. I did not have the independence. I wished I did. I wanted to. I wanted to be like Howard Rourke. And that is what it did for me. I knew that the best elements of me were Howard Rourke, that I already had little pieces of him, pieces of Howard Rourke were in there somewhere, and that's in part, what I was responding to. The parts of myself that I most valued and thought were the best parts of me are here being expressed in this character. I want to be more like those parts of me. Yeah, absolutely. Art is there, you see, by projecting an ideal like John Galt or Howard Rourke. It's not saying this is the way people journalistically are. Ayn Rand very much knew that most men are not journalistically like Howard Rourke or John Galt. But it is the abstraction, the essentializing of what makes them ideal, a moral man, a hero in her mind. And that essentialization can provide an inspiration for me, or an inspiration for the boy on the bicycle being given an inspiration for a lifetime to be a composer in that wonderful scene in The Fountainhead, just from seeing Howard Rourke's architecture.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a lot worth thinking about and talking about just the phenomenon of exactly how it should stand in one's mind, the heroes, right? So the idea, I know I will never be a John Galt. Like my reaction is, on the one hand, I get what the person's saying, but on the other hand, I would never say that, because if you think about sort of what the character is giving you, like, when you see heroes, part of what one could, there's kind of there's a emotional desire for emulation. So admiration, I think, comes or should come with a feeling of a motivation for emulation. Like I want to be like them in some sense. And I think as a kid, the some sense is it is something like, I want to be, fill in the blank. Like I want to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, or I want to be, who's a childhood artistic hero. My mind's kind of going blank, but for Ayn Rand, Cyrus, right? There's a way in which I want to be. Part of what you get as you grow up is much more, there's principles that make me admire this person, and I want to embody those principles. But it's, I want to embody the principles, not like I want to be like them. So if you think about the classic example in the objectivist world, is the people who would way back when used to dye their hair orange because Howard Rourke had orange hair. And it comes from a good place in the sense of they want to emulate something they admire, but they're emulating the concretes rather than the universal abstractions. And so like, it doesn't stand in my mind as like, oh, there's John Galt and I can never be John Galt. It's, I admire John Galt. Well, why do I admire him? And there's some universal things that are true of all of Ayn Rand's heroes that he has. And that's true, that he's pro-reason, he's productive. There's certain unique features of him that maybe I want to emulate, or maybe I don't, or they might be different. And I'm talking about universal things, not necessarily like, oh, he's a physicist, but take the fact that his defining characteristic is his serenity. Do I respond more to that kind of serenity? Do I respond more to Francisco's larger than life boldness and humor and wit and daring? Do I respond more to like Dagny's tenaciousness or Reardon's kind of like, solemn strength? But it's thinking about what is it about them that I admire, and then thinking about the role of the abstraction in my life. And so I certainly agree that even if one says like Galt's serenity is something that I admire, it's not if I fall 1% short, I should beat myself up. No, the journey, like becoming more serene, like that's a real value. I'm not judging myself in relation to Galt, but that's what I'm trying to highlight is be very, very careful. It's like, oh, I can be or I can't be one of any, whether it's Ayn Rand's characters or anything else. I think once you reach the adult level, what you should be striving for is what in them am I responding to? And once you have it, can I be rational? Can I be productive? Can I be just? Can I be serene? Serenity is a little bit different because it includes things that aren't fully volitional. So like, if you have trauma as a kid, it might be that you can never have like Galt's level of serenity with our current psychological knowledge. But the point being, you're spotting the abstraction, and there, for many of them, it's just purely a volitional issue. So yeah, of course I can be that. Can I be a genius? No, I can't.
Well, that was the distinction that I was about to draw, and the qualification I was about to make. Don't beat yourself up if you can't be a genius like John Galt. But absolutely, what Don is saying is correct. I can be just as virtuous.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is crazy when you the first time I think either Leonard or Ayn Rand herself put it in some form. She didn't. I don't think she put it in the novels, but maybe her biographical interview. But she has this line where somebody has pointed out, like, Eddie Willers is just as moral as John Galt in the sense of being fully committed to doing the good. And that's shocking, but it's also really important to get at Ayn Rand's view of morality. He's not going to be as successful at living as Galt. In a fundamental sense, he will be. He'll be fully connected to reality, but he requires the Galts in order to live in America versus America falling apart, right? So yeah, you can't necessarily have the genius or any concrete feature of somebody, but that's why the whole thing you're looking for is you want to admire him, but you want to emulate the abstraction.
Exactly. Their rationality, their independence, that we can achieve.
We have a third super chat. We're making big bucks here. It's from Bunny, and the question is: can this program, I guess, meaning what this chat, can this program function as art in the context of our culture? Experiencing intelligent conversation is a lifeline. A conceptual being does want a reason for everything, and art can do that.
Merely having a positive psychological impact, it does not make something an aesthetic experience yet, much less a work of art. And certainly conversations like this can have a huge, enormous impact on us psychologically, and a similar one in the sense that it helps us clarify our values, even emotionally experience some of our values in the course of an intelligent conversation, if that's what we're having. I think we are. But it is not in itself a work of art or an aesthetic experience. That's a very distinct thing. A work of art is a recreation of reality based on the artist's metaphysical value judgments. That is to say, it is a concrete recreation, a mimesis of reality that's getting at sense of life level emotions. That is a very specific thing. And although sense of life, as Don says, we carry it with us all the time, our sense of life. Our implicit view of philosophy, as we emotionally hold it, is going to apply when we make friends, the way we enjoy spending our time around the pool, let's say, or the way we enjoy going to an art museum. They are each of them different sorts of applications of experiencing our sense of life. And that can provide huge emotional rewards. It's part of the, time is running out for early registration on Ocon this year. I urge people, if they have any interest, to get over there and check out Ocon this year, because it's not just the lectures you're going to hear, but the social interaction you're going to have, the other values that are going to be shared there, that can have a huge psychological impact. A psychological impact as healthy as a great work of art. But the fact that it has a benevolent psychological impact, even one similar to what great art can do, doesn't make it a work of art yet. It's still just a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Brandon puts it in the psychology of pleasure is that every pleasure is a reward and incentive to further action, right? And you need that. You need that sense of success now in order to continue. The uniqueness of art is not in the fact that it gives you fuel, but the particular kind of fuel, that it's the realization of your deepest, most long-range values today. And in a sense, in a way that you can only get from art, which is the I'm living in my ideal world, because you're always going to have ambition. Remember, Ayn Rand says the ambitions of a man are unlimited. In your life, you always want to create and improve things in certain ways. Even if we lived in, like, the equivalent of Atlantis in real life, art gives you the idea of like that final achievement where like everything's in place, everything's resolved. There's no more further goals in this context to achieve. And that's a unique thing that you can only get from art, and in a different way in sex. And so they're the you're hitting on the fact that it's the same basic phenomenon of pleasure as being crucial part of emotional fuel. But it's a good question that I think helped us kind of highlight the uniqueness of this particular aesthetic pleasure in human life.
And we have a fourth super chat from Marvin again. He says, "Thank you. One more. Is my selection of fashion, jewelry, and interior design a selected representation of my values and sense of life?" Happy face.
Well, the fact that it's important enough in your life that you ask this question, my guess is yes. Now, it's not the same, and Jim really did a good job of stressing that there's things that are artistic versus art. That, but what is true is that it sounds like you're making these questions, you're making these decisions about your fashion, your jewelry, how you design your house, in the way that an artist does. That it's not an artistic standard of selection, not this is metaphysically important, but that it's stylized. In other words, you're choosing things in order to reflect your values. So like right now, I just have like a black t-shirt on because I always wear black t-shirts under my, sweaters, and today's hot, so I don't have a sweater, right? It's not chosen for anything, but I'm interested in fashion. So like when I am like getting dressed up, I'm picking things that I think express something about me beyond just like utility, like keep me warm when it's cold or keep me cool when it's hot. And those are definitely an expression of your values and sense of life. And indeed, I think one of the most important parts, one of the exciting things about selfishness is not just the big picture, values and virtues that one cultivates, but it's the stress on make every aspect of your life a purposeful expression of your values. So like Ayn Rand had this idea of she has her favorites in every realm, and that you really want to kind of pursue your favorite. So it's like, I was not naturally like this in every realm. Most stuff I didn't care about, but as I've grown, part of what I've tried to do is cultivate my favorites. And then when I find something I like, I'm like going to go all in on it. So like when I resurrected my interest in baseball, it was, oh man, I'm going to really learn about this. I'm going to enjoy it. I threatened my wife with buying a Phillies pillow cover this morning. I don't, she's a higher value though, so I don't want to get divorced, but we won't do that. But no, I love that. Yeah, pick every area that you're interested in and be as interested in as many areas of life as you can. Really figure out, how do I express my values? And I think that's fantastic, and I encourage people to do more of that.
Absolutely. There are all kinds of aesthetic type values that aren't necessarily works of art. And it can apply in so many different ways in our life. Really, from just the way we decorate our homes, to the clothes we wear, to the jokes we tell. They can be expressions of all of them can be expressions of our sense of life, and fill your life with the best values you could possibly find. Yeah.
Okay. Given that brief deviation of the talk, I would like to return a little bit to the this discussion of the relationship between art and reality. And I think one of the questions that would capture the topic is does an artist fake reality? Um, Basically, that's it.
Well,
And
and so we just, I think, named the essential issue. Ayn Rand puts it as he stylizes it, or she stylizes it. And what does that mean? It's that you're picking everything deliberately in order to stress something. And at the most fundamental level, it's you're stressing this is life as I see it. In a more narrow level, it's this is what's relevant to my theme. In an even more narrow level, there's kind of sub things that are involved in it. There's a really interesting series of pieces by Tora Buchman where he talks about, sort of a theme integrates everything, but there's certain kind of optional choices that are integrated around an artist's particular values. So, like, for instance, Ayn Rand didn't have to have her heroes and heroines falling in love through kind of like, clashing initially, but that was her personal view of like what was the most exciting kind of romance. So it's part of what romanticism is it's the artist individual values that are crystallized and that are concretized. So the point is that an artist has a standard of selection that about them and their values and their way of looking at the world that's used to select everything. So no, there's no faking involved. It's because a story is literally true. This is life as Ayn Rand sees it. This is life as Victor Hugo sees it. It would be faking if it was published in the New York Times. Well, if it's published in the New York Times, it's all faking. But no, it's faking if you write like an autobiography and you make up a whole bunch of details. But if you write a story, you're being literally true and factual about like, no, this is life as I see it. And it's the fact that it's stylized. It's chosen by a standard of personal values, a personal way of looking at the world that is involved.
Ayn Rand would quote Aristotle, his famous quote on literature and history. Aristotle believed that history was important, but literature was even more important because it doesn't tell us the way things were, but the way things can be and should be. And that's what art does. Far from faking reality, it excludes the irrelevant so we can get at the essentialized aspect of reality that the artist wants us to focus on. They're not lying to us, they're telling us that this comes from their imagination. So it's not a lie. It's not faking reality in a dishonest sense at all. In fact, it's a kind of deep honesty. I'm trying to get at an essence by excluding the non-essential. So in fact, they're aiming at a certain kind of truth, not faking it at all.
Thank you. Um, so I had a couple of questions, a couple of more questions related to that, but I think we're a bit behind schedule. So I think we could move ahead with the profound need of art, which is the next part of the essay. And interestingly, we've touched in that several times. So maybe this could be a short discussion, but um, what does it mean that a viewer of art needs confirmation of the view of his life, in essence?
Well, she's very clear that it's not confirmation in the sense of somebody patting you in the back and going, "Hey, this is true. I know you weren't sure of it, but now you really know it's true." What confirmation really means is concretization. It's that it gives you your view of life in perceptual form, in a form that you can experience directly. And it's in that sense that it's confirmation. It's saying, like, hey, that internal sense of life that you have, that internal feel about what life is, here it is. And you go, oh yeah, there it is. That's it right there in front of me. Okay, I got it. No, this is amazing. Like, this is hugely important to me. So it's in that sense that it's confirming. It's the sense of, insofar as it does concretize in to some extent your way of looking at the world, that's the way in which it's confirmation. And I think that makes it more clear why you need confirmation, because if it makes more sense of why you would want to see your vision of life objectified and a world that you can step into and live in for a period of time, versus if it was just like a pat in the back and going, hey, this is true, like that, it wouldn't be clear why you would need that. But yeah, so I think of it as concretization is the real issue.
It's the full emotional experience of our most abstract and invisible, in that sense, values. It's rendering visible what's really the highest level of abstraction and the emotional experience of it. That's what it's about. How can I fully experience my highest evaluative ideas and concepts and fully emotionally experience it? Art or romantic love. Those are really the ways in which we can concretely, emotionally experience our entire philosophy of life. That's what Ayn Rand is saying.
And one of the things that Rand says is that rational man usually seeks a very specific type of art, and an irrational man also seeks a very specific kind of art. But she also talks about that usually the case is more people of mixed premises. Do you have maybe there are many people, and probably all people are mixed premises, but do you think of artists that reflect these mixed premises while making art?
All the time.
And recent example, yeah.
One of the saddest things about experiencing really great skilled art is having some fundamental philosophical difference, or some philosophical difference that's manifesting itself emotionally, where you're like, I wish I could be there with you, Mr. Artist. You're so good at it. You really, you employed all the skills necessary, but I just can't share that powerful emotion with you because I don't agree with that fundamental philosophy. Yeah, all the time do they have mixed premises, all the time. Victor Hugo is a classic example, a Christian socialist who really is, say, in Les Mis, spelling out the difference between what he thinks of as two different approaches to morality: the Javert rigid view of morality versus the more Christian, forgiving view of morality represented by Valjean. Now, we might disagree with his philosophy, but does he also have some good thinking, implicit philosophy that must be behind it? Yeah, free will. A person's ability. In a Hugo novel, his heroes hold their lives in the palm of their hand, and you get that sense that his main figures are choosing their destiny as they're choosing how to act and how to think. So, is there good philosophy that must be behind Hugo? Yeah. There's also a bunch of bad philosophy. On balance, what comes out is this exalted view of the human potential, though, despite his bad ideas that he's also conveying in various ways. Mixed premises is the norm.
So, being said that, I think we can move on to the last part of the essay, and that's the judgment and praising of art. And I think one of the ways that one can think about that is that scene in the Dead Poets Society when Keating, the professor, not the person in the fountainhead, goes and asks the people in the classroom to start reading the opening paragraph. I think it's a fake book about some J. Evans Pritchard, and this J. Evans Pritchard says that when one's with poetry, one has to put like a scale, and on one side one has to take the rhyme, and then the other one has to measure the importance of the metric, and the importance of the poem, and the character of Robin Williams is, I think this is he says, well, I don't know, I don't remember that he disagrees very emphatically. But I think both views aren't precisely on point from Ayn Rand's view. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah. So if I take it to be, and I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but if I take it to be that one side says there's technical mastery that is the standards by which we judge a poem, And Robin Williams saying, no, it's about the spiritual meaning and impact that it has on our lives. I think you can say, in effect, part of what Ayn Rand is saying here is that ultimately you need an integration of the two. That's not exactly how she thinks of the distinction. It's more, one side of it is the ability of an artist to technically convey his or her view of the world. And then the other is, does that view of the world resonate with me? Which is another way of saying, is it kind of true or false? Assuming that one has a view of the world that one thinks is true. And but you can see there's a certain kind of parallel there. And yeah, and she has an analysis, and I forget if it's in this essay or one of the other ones, because I was rereading them kind of back to back. But she talks about how, like, the or maybe it's in the art of fiction, but that there's you can definitely have a situation where, in effect, the artist's technical mastery is better than his view of the world. And I wouldn't even put Hugo in exactly that, because there the division is not, he has his technical mastery and a view of the world that's implicitly amazing. As Jim said, he has reverence for mankind. That's like the essence of him, is just reverence for man. But then he has an explicit philosophy, which is kind of the third category. And if you go through Leonard Peikoff's 8 Great Plays, part of what you see is that there's a technical mastery, there's a thematic meaning and how everything's integrated to that, but then there's kind of a philosophic meaning for the best of plays. But then there's also the kind of people whose their philosophy is better than their means. So like I mean, arguably, this is sort of where I am, where I'm still developing as an artist and learning skills. I think I'm not a hack. So like, or, I know quite a bit. But that, like, it's not the technical mastery of a Tolstoy, right? But it's presumably a more true philosophy than a Tolstoy. And
let's hope.
Yeah, let's definitely hope. And then she thinks there's the hacks, where, like, these are people who don't have anything going on except for just kind of bad imitation. So these things can play out in different ways, but it's important to have in mind, obviously you want the integration, but the most important thing from us as viewers and enjoyers of art is the ability to distinguish, what are we evaluating? And it's completely okay to say, I love this, even though I regard it as really messed up in these ways. Like, Ayn Rand said that her favorite novel didn't have a plot. I'm going blank. Does anybody remember the name of it? Calmy K.
Hey, it is a pretty much plotless description of this grain silo.
Yeah, it's these guys basically, like, I mean, this is really the essence of the story. Hey, we're trying to get something done at work and it's not going well.
Right.
Like, that's the story. It's engaging, it's fascinating, and she gives the reasons why she loves it. It's an efficacious man, a producer, and that to her is a profound value to her that she hasn't seen anywhere else. So the point is just that one has to be objective, and that means recognizing that we can evaluate an artist by, are you able to express your view of the world down to the smallest detail and with the best vividness and choice of subject, smallest brush stroke, whatever it is. And then we can say, well, how does it impact me? Like, what is the view of the world that it's expressing? I'm actually blending together. She talks about two things, which is the view of the world true or not? What I'm saying is that there's also kind of a third thing, which is I can like things out of context as long as I know they're out of context. That's Leonard Peikoff. If you want to watch a movie because there's an actress in it you adore, and you say, this movie's garbage, the philosophy's garbage, but she or he is, like, brings me to my knees, that's fine, as long as you're being objective about the element you're responding to.
Exactly. There are times when the technique of an artist is so outstanding, and I have enough of appreciation for that technique, that I will have an emotional reaction simply to the power of the artistry, even if I substantively disagree with the philosophy or emotionally don't buy into the sense of life that's being conveyed. Essentially the same question. On the other hand, there can be somewhat simplistic, but more romantic art that I will have a positive emotion to, but realize it's much, much cruder as art. It's just not as good. There comes a point where it becomes so crude stylistically that even if it's saying something that I agree with, I'm not going to have much of a reaction to. But
Well,
on the
Ayn Rand, I think, even says like I forget how she puts it, but it's the equivalent of that makes it that can make it worse. Like if you've ever, Jim, have you ever read like bad objectivist literature? The fact that it's object now that's partly an issue of imitation more than bad means, but
yes, there are a couple of novelists who've actually published some somewhat successful novels that are badly imitative of Ayn Rand's style, in my view, and some of it goes well below even my tolerance level. It makes it worse, as Don points out. It's almost an insult to the philosophical values that it's trying to convey, and therefore is offensive. Therefore, turns me off. And on the other hand, there could be something that I philosophically disagree with, but it's done with such skill and power that I'll have an emotional reaction simply to the power with which that artist is conveying it.
Well, I'll give an example. This isn't this is movies, but my favorite filmmaker is Tarantino. And I recognize 100% his philosophy is a disaster. Now that his sense of life is interesting because in one sense it's really, really bad, but part of it is he wants life to be interesting. Like that to him, it's just I put a very big primacy on that. But nevertheless, a lot of it is it's the technical mastery that I respond to in it. And I totally get while I have close friends, including people who I hate even admitting this to because their view of him is this is the kind of nihilistic garbage that Ayn Rand, condemns.
Well, there's a kind of nihilism to it, but wouldn't it be interesting if some out of work stuntman did interfere with the Manson family back in the day? So you're right. If Tarantino is creating unusual context, circumstances, weird moments that you find, that is the sort of unusual situation you find interesting to contemplate. That's a value in itself. I'm not sure if it would overcome the nihilism in my mind, but it can be a question of individual values on that level, and there are options here. That is to say,
I was a teenager in the 90s, so I to me nihilism is the water I swim in.
Thankfully, I've never seen this subjectivist art that you refer to, but I have seen a couple of. I think, for me, the best movie that I've seen ever it's The Age of Innocence, and I dislike it awfully. I think it's Madame Bovary version 3055, but I think it's a beautiful movie.
Yeah, and see, as all the values we share, I cannot stand Flaubert. Madame Bovary drives me up a wall. It really does, and I appreciate his skill and so forth, but just so not me. Madame Bovary is so not me. I do not enjoy contemplating the story, no matter how skilled Flaubert was.
But notice this is part of one of the reasons it's useful to have these distinctions in mind is if you I think most of us, if we're at all interested in art or even kind of movies in a serious way, you can either lose or feel like you're going to lose friendships with people in these arguments. And if you have the ability to isolate, well, this is what I like, and I totally get why you looking at this other aspect have a completely different response. It allows us not to feel like our personal values are being attacked. Because remember, the whole thing about art, or a crucial part of it, is that the emotion is enormously personally intense. So why in the world would I not want to be friends with somebody because we have different views of art? But often it's because if the disagreement is not able to make crucial distinctions between what you're responding to, it's that you feel personally attacked. They feel like an alien creature. And so if you're able to say, for instance, no, I recognize that Tolstoy is a brilliant novelist, able to convey his view of the world so effectively, but I think his ideas and sense of life are so evil, I don't respond to it. And even his art, the one area where he's weakest is on the plot side, and that's crucially important to me. The fact that the more that you can draw out what you're responding to and what you're not and why, the more that you can have conversations with people where you're passionate about them, but you no longer feel like it's a personal attack when somebody says, yeah, I don't like XYZ because I think it's weak in these areas.
But one of the key things about friendship and in general is the kind of psychological visibility we get. And that's why it's really important to break these things down. I have a feeling that, Alejandro, you and I would agree philosophically about things, and that whatever the difference is in the age of, in fact, I like the Age of Innocence for several reasons. And those reasons we might actually share a lot of those. So I think what Don is saying is absolutely correct. When we choose friends, just as with a romantic partner, we are using our sense of life as a filter. Is this person going to reflect, in effect, my values? And part of that is sense of life. Part of the important part of our judgment when we choose friends is a sense of life thing, whether we know it or not. But the key here is what Don, I think, is saying. Once we break down the elements, a lot of the personal aspect goes away. But it's always going to be personal, because this is your metaphysics being expressed emotionally. It should be personal. It's got to be the most personal. In fact, you've got to feel it like, this is me. This is life to me. That's what art is getting at.
Thank you. So we only have 5 minutes left. So I was wondering if you have a concluding remarks for this essay. What can one get from reading it?
For me, anytime I look at Ayn Rand's aesthetic theory, it just blows me away. It absolutely does. Her theory of concepts, or understanding of concepts, to bring it full circle to the beginning, is exactly the basis for her revolutionary theory of aesthetics. Head and shoulders above any other philosophical theory of aesthetics, frankly. Ayn Rand, her theory of aesthetics is a revolution of a kind never before attempted in the history of philosophy. No doubt about it. And it is the emanation, the manifestation of her understanding of concepts. To understand the role of art is to basically understand her theory of concepts and the role of concepts in human cognition. So I am forever blown away by how her epistemology gave her this powerful insight into the psychological function of art.
Yeah, and my basic point that I'll make is, I mean, my favorite paragraph in here, and it's one of my favorite paragraphs of Ayn Rand ever, is where she talks about art giving you that, hour or moment of refueling. And we also talked about the way in which that it's not automatic that you know how to get something out of art, that often this has to be learned, particularly the greater the art is, which is one of the paradoxes, that it's precisely that they have the most to give you, that you have to put in the most work to get it. And so I just want to encourage people, like, do that not as a duty, but as kind of like a little adventure that has the potential to reap dividends. Because, I've often thought, or at least I have for the last few years, that a crucial part about conveying to people what objectivism really means by selfishness and the value that it really has to offer, a big part of it is the crucial central value of art in a selfish life. It's just so different from what people put into the category of selfish that it should kind of astonish them. But B, it really is something that should be central to your life. Enjoying great art, like that, is at the level in terms of the depth of the experience one can have of romance and sex, of productive achievement. And so, but it's very easy not to nurture. And many people don't. Like, they have their kind of toe in the water with some entertainment and things, and that's great. Like, I'm not saying take that away. But if you add in this other thing, I think it's some needs, if they go unfulfilled, it's very stark. If you can't breathe, you can't breathe, and that's not very good. Even if, like, not having sex for a while, like, that need becomes kind of like in your face, so, as it were, right? Art is often one of those things that you just notice it as a nagging sense of lowered expectations, the sense of when people talk about, like, like, there's just nothing that really fulfills me in life. And, like, the becoming bland, conventional, I think a lot of that is the mark of not having art. So fulfill that damn need, people.
Great. Thank you very much for that conclusions. Very inspiring. So I thank you both for this incredible discussion again. And I also thank all the super chatters, Bonnie, Marvin, Jeff. And if you like these kind of discussions, please consider having a membership with the Ayn Rand Center UK. They start with £10 a month. And if you want to continue other discussions in 30 minutes, we will have one in Clubhouse. It's Flirting with Reason with Nikos and Maria. And the discussion will be about femcells, fact or fiction. And I have no clue what femcells are, but please go on to that. Thank you.